China quietly launched its Fujian aircraft carrier, which crossed the Taiwan Strait and headed straight for the South China Sea. Officially, the move was described as sea trials, but it was clearly a planned military provocation. The timing was deliberate, on America's most solemn national day, and the messaging was consistent. Not aimed at any specific country. Less than 24 hours later, British and American warship conducted a joint military maneuver through the Taiwan Strait in a direct response. What made this situation even more awkward for China was that the Fujian, touted as the next-generation aircraft carrier, was closely monitored by Japan's self-defense forces, who published high-resolution images showing a completely empty flight deck, no aircraft, not even a pilot. Why did China choose this day? It wasn't to intimidate Taiwan, but to send a message to the US. You have an electromagnetic catapult aircraft carrier. Now I have one too. But the real question remains, how effective is their electromagnetic catapult system? Are they even ready to use it? The truth about military technology, a politically staged performance. China has packaged the Fujian aircraft carrier as a powerful symbol of its military progress, describing it as the first domestically produced catapult carrier, and labeling China as the world's third largest naval power. The country rolled out one national pride poster after another, presenting the ship as fully battle-ready, capable of launching and recovering J-35 fighter jets from the first island chain. But here's the reality. As of September 11th, the Fujian had not even been formally delivered. It hasn't been assigned to any military region or included in active duty. There's no clear command structure, let alone operational capability. Not only the J-35 jets, China has also yet to release any footage of basic carrier-based flight operations, and the much-discussed electromagnetic catapult system has not undergone a complete and consistent test with an actual aircraft. Additionally, the KJ-600, an aircraft intended to serve as a carrier-based AWACS, has never been seen operating alongside the carrier. The Fujian's first debut was a showcase with an empty deck, accompanied by two aging destroyers, the Hangzhou and Jinan, trailing behind. It was almost like a wedding march in a second-hand tractor. Even more ironically, China's state media tried to spin the event as a naval exercise organized by the Eastern Theater Command, attempting to frame it as a well-planned strategic operation. But here's the issue. The Fujian still lacks a home base, and port facilities haven't been completed. Where's the coordination for a naval fleet? Observers pointed out that this wasn't a demonstration of a new generation of military power. It was a half-baked vessel hurriedly pushed into the spotlight under immense political pressure. The real goal was to get photos and media coverage. A truly capable aircraft carrier requires three key components to be fully operational: a mature and reliable air wing, a functioning and controllable catapult and recovery system, and a fully integrated command and coordination system. The Fujian lacks all three of these essential elements. This wasn't a carrier launch. It was a political event. It wasn't about demonstrating technological capabilities, but rather about signaling loyalty to the party. The task was completed, the video was filmed, and the images were shared. The next step involved internal propaganda, editing, accompanied by a narrative like the Chinese Navy marches boldly into the deep blue. Systemic gaps, not low-key but insecure. This political showcase exposed far more than just a ship. It revealed major flaws in China's naval systems. First, China has not publicly demonstrated the full capabilities of its electromagnetic catapult system. There has been no footage of J-35 launches, no footage of the KJ-600 airborne, and no complete display of simulated takeoffs. This lack of transparency is likely not due to the security concerns, but rather because the system may not be fully operational. If it were ready, the most effective response to skepticism would be to showcase its functionality. But this has not happened. Additionally, the escort configuration for the Fujian highlights gaps in China's so-called modern navy. Despite being China's newest aircraft carrier, the Fujian is being escorted by destroyers that are over 20 years old. The reason no newer ships are involved is clear. Fujian has not been formally commissioned or assigned to any fleet. As a result, No one is willing to take responsibility for it, leading to the deployment of older ships simply to get the photos without a coordinated fleet operation. The most significant issue is that while the Fujian's deck was empty, its underwater vulnerabilities became exposed. Its highly publicized journey through the Taiwan Strait likely placed it under the scrutiny of the US, Japan, and Taiwan's underwater monitoring system. Without anti-submarine escorts or carrier-based anti-submarine aircraft, the Fujian became a floating strategic target. Finally, the route taken by the Fujian exposed a significant strategic weakness in the Chinese Navy, one that remains unresolved, revealing it to the global audience. The date choice. This isn't a coincidence, it's political calculus. To understand this military action, it's crucial to examine the timing, as it was not coincidental. The Chinese government claimed that the Fujian Sea trial was a normal arrangement and not aimed at any specific target. But when considering the details, the intention becomes clear. First, the Fujian was not part of the September 3 military parade. Second, September 11 is a highly sensitive day in the US, marking the anniversary of the War on Terror. Third, the operation involved an empty deck, older ships escorting the carrier, and media reports with a consistent message: this is not aimed at any specific country. This was actually a carefully orchestrated political event. If it were truly a planned sea trial, why wait until September 11th? Why not launch the ship on September 3rd, taking advantage of the military parade to gain maximum international attention? Instead, China deliberately waited 8 days, choosing September 11 to depart from Shanghai. The Fujian crossed the East China Sea, passed near the Diaoyu Island, and then entered the Taiwan Strait. The primary goal was not to showcase military readiness or to conduct training in the South China Sea. It was a deliberate attempt to provoke the United States. This was designed to send a clear message to the US on a highly sensitive day. The action reflects a mindset rooted in China's historical grievances, directly challenging the existing international order. By choosing this specific timing, China positioned itself as a new, confrontational force on the global stage. This was not a routine military operation, but a politically motivated action aimed at challenging the fundamental values of the international community. The strategic dilemma: this isn't strength, but dangerous exposure. Between late 2024 and early this year, to respond to the US-Philippine Shield of Courage military exercises, the Shandong aircraft carrier deployment frequency and duration peaked. However, after returning to the Yuling Naval Base in Shangya, Hainan in June, its activity sharply declined. For nearly 3 months, there was only one brief offshore operation lasting less than 3 days, which is inconsistent with its role as China's sole aircraft carrier in the South China Sea. During this period, the U.S. Navy Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group entered the South China Sea twice, conducting joint exercises with the British HMS Prince of Wales. According to the Chinese Navy previous practice of shadowing all carriers, the Shandong should have been deployed for a standoff, but no such action was taken. Chinese state media, particularly CCTV-7's military channel and the PLA Daily, reported nothing on the Shandong in the past 3 months. All related news articles were recycled from past footage, repurposed for other topics. This prolonged information vacuum surrounding a so-called national treasure ship is highly unusual. Meanwhile, the Liaoning aircraft carrier based in Qingdao and primarily used for training and research had several official reports of seagoing exercises. These reports seem to be used to fill the gap left by the lack of activity from the primary combat carrier. High-resolution images taken by commercial satellite companies like Maxar and Planet Labs between August and September show that the Shandong has been docked at the Yuling base for an extended period with no signs of significant resupply of ammunition or fuel. The image revealed that its flight deck was only a small number of fixed J-15 aircraft models with no movement or training activity. Several areas of the deck were covered with maintenance equipment or tarps, suggesting possible unplanned extended repairs. The Shandong supply ship, the 901 type Chang'an Lake, has remained docked in Danjiang port for the past few months without participating in any joint operations with the Shandong. A report from Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense think tank speculated that the Shandong may have suffered a serious power system failure. Its steam turbine and boilers inherited from the Russian-built Kuznetsov-class carriers are prone to corrosion and power degradation under the South China Sea's high salt, high heat, and humidity conditions, especially with long-term high-load operations. The U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence (ONI) also suggested that the issue may be with the Shandong's aircraft. The J-15 Flying Shark carrier-based fighters has faced criticism for its heavy airframe, insufficient engine thrust, and high accident rate. It's possible that a major flight accident of widespread structural fatigue cracks led to a mass grounding of the aircraft, rendering the Shandong air wing and combat capabilities ineffective. All evidence point to a high probability. As China's only aircraft carrier in the South China Sea, the Shandong has likely lost its operational combat capability due to significant technical failures or aircraft issues. The Chinese government cannot afford to have a downtime for its most important strategic asset in the South China Sea. Therefore, the real mission of the Fujian southern deployment is to urgently fill this gap. Even if the Fujian itself is an untested, half-finished aircraft carrier, it must be deployed to cover for the Shandong's failure. This is a political maneuver, using the Fujian's new aircraft carrier status to cover up the major scandal of the Shandong's operational collapse. The approach of this mission had to serve the purpose of addressing this sensitive issue. Why did the Fujian sail empty, without its aircraft? This decision reflects the insecurity surrounding the ship. It needed to meet the South China Sea deployment goal, but also wanted to hide its unpreparedness. By not bringing aircraft on board, China avoids publicly revealing that the Fujian's air wing and systems are still untested. A full deployment with aircraft would have shown its limitations if it couldn't perform properly in the South China Sea. The empty deployment also allows China to justify it as a security measure, preventing early exposure of the J-35's capability. At the same time, it conceals the fact that the ship's aviation system is still unreliable and that the air wing has not completed its training. Therefore, the Fujian's journey is a classic example of a smoke and mirror strategy, using a political provocation to mask the reality of a military shift. This strategic secrecy hides the technological insecurity behind the operation. The ship, with its significant political expectations, is already navigating through a path of deception from its very first mission. If the Fujian is eventually assigned to the southern theater, it will need to make several trips through the Taiwan Strait for maintenance, including returning to the Shanghai shipyard for inspections. In the event of war, however, this route could become a death corridor. Taiwan's coastal anti-ship missiles can lock onto targets in just a few minutes. U.S. Navy ships are regularly stationed in the East China Sea, and Japan has publicly deployed anti-ship cruise missiles. During wartime, the Taiwan Strait will likely be blocked by a joint U.S.-Japan-Taiwan military blockade, making passage nearly impossible. In such a scenario, both the Fujian and Shandong could be trapped in the South China Sea, unable to reinforce a primary assault on Taiwan, leading to a strategic gap. If they attempt to navigate the Bashi Channel into the Eastern Theater, they would be forced into the home waters of U.S. aircraft carriers in the Philippine Sea. Once a conflict begins, returning from there may not be possible. 4. The gamble behind the move: internal struggles, bargaining chips, and disaster. What drove China to undertake such a risky, strategically flawed gamble? The answer points to unresolved internal and external crisis. First, there's a deep internal contradictions. If the choice of September 11 to act highlighted China's external hostility, the numerous irregularities surrounding this operation points to a deeper internal crisis. This seemingly bold move may have been a forced damage control measure. The growing divide between the military and the core leadership is a key factor. In recent years, Xi Jinping's ongoing purges within the military have led to instability, with generals expressing increasing resistance. At the September 3rd military parade, senior officers appeared to perform in a way that suggested little enthusiasm or genuine support. The Shandong's deployment, escorted by 2 older ships from the Eastern Theater Command, reflects this passive resistance. No one wanted to risk their core assets for a political display by the leader, and no one was willing to bear potential risk. This shows that Xi's control over the military is not as strong as the propaganda suggests. Trust in him has broken down. Second, there were diplomatic calculations behind this move. China's decision to display its military strength at this time is tied to ongoing critical negotiations with the U.S. from Beijing's perspective. The deployment of the Fujian was a deliberate attempt to apply significant pressure. It aimed to create leverage outside of the negotiation table, signaling to US that if its conditions were not met, China had a capacity to increase tensions in the Western Pacific. This is a typical tactic of using military posturing as a tool for diplomacy. However, this gamble, which combined internal instability with external calculations, ended in a disastrous failure. To the international community, this display of strength appeared less as a demonstration of power and more as a reflection of China's leadership's irrational approach. Instead of intimidating the US, it strengthened the position of hardliners in Washington. The US could use images of the Fujian September 11 deployment to highlight to its allies and other nations that China's government disregards rules and respect, and that negotiations with China require strength, not assumptions. As a result, this move did not result in any diplomatic gains and instead removed any remaining space for compromise. It accelerated the integration of military alliances among the US, the UK, Japan, and Australia, and encouraged more Southeast Asian countries to align with the US. China intended to create a diplomatic bargaining chip, but it ended up providing irrefutable evidence of the China's threat theory. This gamble was a complete failure. Number 5. The US wasn't provoked, it was ready to respond. On September 5th, 2 days after China's military parade, US President Trump announced that the Department of Defense would be renamed the Department of War. This wasn't just a name change, it was a shift in strategy. For years, the US maintained a defensive posture, focusing on restraint, self-defense, and limited responses. But in the face of China's repeated crossing of red lines, subtle provocations, and gray zone tactics, the US decided to enter combat readiness mode. The shift from a defensive approach to a more proactive stance marked Trump's version of a strategic pivot. When the Fujian crossed the Taiwan Strait on September 11th, the US and British fleets immediately responded by crossing the Taiwan Strait the following day. The message is clear. China's actions prompted an immediate response, and the US countered accordingly. More importantly, the world saw that while China has an aircraft carrier, it has not been used in combat. The US has both a clear position and the capability to back it up. The Fujian September 11 deployment was not a demonstration of strength, but rather exposed a weakness. It made clear that China's military power isn't ready for action, it's more of a show. The carrier is not built for war, but for ceremonial purposes. China's strategic strike capabilities have yet to be developed, and the geographical constraints were exposed. This was a typical political performance, an attempt to talk about war and then be caught in a corner. The renaming of the US Department of Defense to the Department of War was not about preparing for conflict, but rather a message to the world: if provoked, the US will not retreat. If the stakes were raised, it will respond in kind. The Fujian's empty deck made this point abundantly clear.